to thank MICA and thank Isaac for inviting me to talk to you all. Thank you for welcoming me this afternoon. As mentioned, my name is Adriana Warner. I am a designer, an organizer, and an activist. Some other important identifiers: I'm a queer, Black, cisgender, able-bodied woman. I'm a leftist, an anti-capitalist, and that's really important to me. So of course, capitalism is a system that requires we work in order to survive. We trade our labor for money and our money for food, water, shelter, medicine, etc. And so that's a huge part of the problem for me. But I wanted to talk to you a little bit about what it can look like when you're balancing your values and your need to work, especially when your profession isn't directly tied to what you believe is right. So over the past few months, we've witnessed a really significant cultural shift, and I do believe we are on the cusp of a historical political transformation. So I'm talking specifically about the transformation taking place in our communities, not necessarily with politicians in office. As designers, we know that art is an incredibly powerful tool for change, and we can leverage that even when we're stuck working for the man. So I just want to tell you a little bit about my professional and political journey, where those intersect, and what I'm up to now. It's pretty hard to pinpoint exactly when I was radicalized, somewhere in between the ages of 11 and 21. And when I completed my undergraduate experience, I went straight into trying to find solutions that would prioritize my values. I had a lot of negative experiences as a Black woman attending art school in Maine. I grew up in the Bronx, and I just chose a school that I felt would offer me some new experiences in a new environment. There, I learned how to sculpt and how to work with type, as well as how to assimilate and navigate aggressively white spaces. So in my opinion, college is traumatizing on so many levels, and adding race and class dynamics to that mix made for a very uncomfortable 4 years. The creative community tends to pride itself on its progressive values and free-thinking attitudes, but in reality, art and design is just as harmful as any other industry. I witnessed blanket erasure of Black, Indigenous, and other people of color from our curriculums and artist lecture rosters. Every single one of my professors was white. There was one other Black girl in my school. People used to get us mixed up all the time, honestly, to the point where my financial aid details were discussed with her in private, even though we look nothing alike. So these kind of experiences led me to really examine my identity while I was in school. I teetered back and forth between fine art and design, producing work that explored ideas of individualism, as well as race. I did have a hard time finding creatives to look to for guidance. My white peers had long lists of relevant artists they could study in order to better understand their own bodies of work. I was always stuck with the lazy comparisons to Kara Walker or even Frida Kahlo, which didn't feel relevant to the work I was creating at the time. This meant that I had to put in more hours of research outside of class because the information that I needed to develop my skills as a Black artist and designer just weren't provided. This led me to try and fix my school the first year after I graduated. I partnered with NAACP Maine, curated a race-focused exhibit, held printmaking workshops, and facilitated artist lectures so we could finally hear from some Black creatives. This led me to my work as an artist in residence at the Department of Public Imagination, based out of the Design Studio for Social Intervention in Boston. There, I also worked with community organizations to facilitate design projects in Boston's nonprofit community. By the end of the residency, I had 2 years of political work in the arts under my belt, and I was really over it. At the time, it felt like I was spending the majority of my energy trying to figure out how to best articulate the worthiness of marginalized folks. I was emotionally drained, depressed, anxious all the time. And I feel like that's something we really don't talk about enough. Like, it's not just hard work because it's 24/7, and it's not just hard work because it's work, but it's hard work because left politics are based in these ideas of humanity. And it's incredibly difficult to spend all of your energy trying to convince people that your life is worth something, while at the same time navigating all of the obstacles these harmful systems put in place. So of course, I took a very intentional break from any work remotely political. I tried to reposition myself within my career. that only kind of worked. My values and my politics are really important to me, and I personally find it pretty difficult to compartmentalize in that way. No matter where I am or what I do, my politics do always float to the top and inform my actions. So after years of basically failing to separate the two, I want to fast forward to what I'm up to now and how I was able to strike a balance. Okay, actually going back a little bit. I've worked at plenty of creative institutions that love to pat themselves on the back when it comes to diversity and inclusion and any other liberal buzzword you can think of. And still I've dealt with manifestations of racism and misogynoir, which is the intersection of anti-Blackness and misogyny that Black women face. When I was at the ICA in Boston, I was considered hostile and unpleasant after returning from a funeral and choosing to keep to myself until I felt well enough to joke with my coworkers. And that was seriously the feedback that I received, because I like to come into work and joke around a lot. And once I was not ready to make jokes, it became an issue for my white coworkers. At AIGA, I had my department head speak to me about straightening my hair and dyeing it blonde. I mean, these, among others, are just examples of how racism manifests in liberal spaces and how white supremacy is so much more insidious than we like to give it credit for. These examples are not meant to publicly shame these institutions, but instead just to make it clear that no one and no institution is safe from the harmful systems that the society was built on. So as individuals, we can choose to challenge these systems. That would be pretty beneficial for your marginalized peers, especially when you have privileges that they don't, because these interactions still follow me everywhere I go. Constantly remembering these and many other occurrences in every job interview, client presentation, business meeting, whatever. I'm gonna remember this stuff for the rest of my life. I would bet money that the white people on the other side of these stories can barely remember my name. But I digress. I wanna discuss what it looks like when I decided to leverage my politics in my current workplace versus when I decided to use my design skills in my political spaces. So I currently work at a small marketing and design agency in Midtown Manhattan. It's been one of the greatest shifts in my career because I've pretty much only ever worked for nonprofits. This agency is the most overtly capitalist space I feel like I've ever been in. And of course, as a socialist, that's pretty uncomfortable for me. The majority of our clients are predatory law firms, Wall Street bankers. Maybe one of our most popular clients is a bank that I'm not sure is okay to mention online, but their wealth is directly tied to chattel slavery. I'm currently the only Black employee, and at one point there were 3 of us, and we all had our hands on this account in one way or another. We would talk online about how harmful the dynamic was, vent about the generational trauma we'd experienced throughout the workday. But still, you know, options are pretty limited for Black creatives, and I do what I need to do to earn a paycheck, right? Anyway, this agency does an annual pro bono project during which we rebrand a nonprofit from top to bottom in order to give back. So for a hot minute, I was really curious about project management and I wanted to give that a try. My boss did allow me to test my project management skills on this account, specifically because of my nonprofit experience. We ended up rebranding Project NIA, which is a Black abolitionist organization. Mind you, this was 2019, before anyone at my agency was willing to entertain the idea of defunding the police. My boss actually held the project up for nearly 2 weeks because she was so uncomfortable, even though we were still accepting slave money from banks, but okay. And maybe that's hyperbolic, but for me as project manager on this account, I was forced to deal with the added labor of coddling all of the uncomfortable white people, including my boss. At the beginning of the project, I was in the closet about my politics. Words like radical, socialism, abolition can be pretty scary for white liberals. They tend to associate those words with violence. On the other hand, they love capitalism, which is a system that necessitates exploitation, but okay. Being put in a position to advocate for my client, pictured here sitting next to me, as project managers do, I eventually let my boss know that I am in fact a socialist and an abolitionist. I do believe that there are better solutions to community conflict than calling the cops and having people locked in cages. So this helped to clear the air a little bit. We were finally able to move forward with the project. My team and I worked really fast and really well to produce work for Project MIA, including new logo, website, posters, swag, editorial, everything. And it was honestly such a big win for me because I do feel like I'm compromising my integrity a little bit by continuing to work for capitalists in this way. So being offered the opportunity to tap into my politics for an agency project was really great. And I don't think the experience would have been the same if I had kept my politics a secret, as I originally planned to do. So this particular work environment is pretty tricky for me to navigate. I have been told I am the lowest on the totem pole, never mind the racist implications of such a saying. I also decided to remove myself from the staff page on the website for personal reasons, and I've been asked over and over to reconsider because my agency is lacking in diversity. So it's not lost on me that my role is belittled to my face, and I'm also expected to offer myself up for tokenization to make the agency look good. I'm supposed to simultaneously believe that I'm the least important person on our team and also the only one who can improve our image. So this isn't my first experience like this. It won't be my last. The funny thing about working in the creative community is that everyone is just assumed to be quote unquote woke. And it feels like there's an unearned sense of comfort at my expense. It's pretty silly. But I am actually lucky to find ways to work around that and complete projects that are actually revolutionary. All of this is to say that my experience as a Black designer has been incredibly uncomfortable and unprofessional. And sadly, it's up to me to figure out how I can work with that. So I was lucky enough to connect with our client on this project and at least walk away from this having built a new relationship with another Black radical. So speaking of, when I'm not working at the agency, I do a ton of work with my political family. I'm heavily involved with the Democratic Socialists of America, more specifically the Afro-Socialists and Socialists of Color Caucus in New York City. So through DSA, I've made some pretty special connections, built a really solid and loving network. You know, like when I was in school, I was taught that networking was this kind of superficial activity that you do where you like hand out business cards at cocktail mixers and you don't reach out to anybody until you need something. But that's not networking. Networking, like real networking, is actually just building community and having relationships with people. And when they think of cool projects that they want to start, they can think of you as someone they want to reach out to, or vice versa. That's how I came across the opportunity to design the identity for JABARI BRISPORT, who is a newly elected New York State Senator. So we were just riding the train back to Brooklyn after a DSA meeting, and he asked if I wanted to help work on his campaign. I decided to keep the identity pretty simple: easy shapes, easy colors, common font, since many volunteers with different levels of accessibility would be helping to build out the assets at different points in the campaign. It just makes sense to do it this way. And again, when we talk about networking, we should be thinking about community. So this is another project that came to me through my community. As a Black designer, that's really important to me. I should mention that with freelance projects, I take on the projects that are just for me, unrelated to any 9-to-5. Those are all in some way connected to my values. Whereas like JABARI BRISPORT is a socialist holding public office, that's pretty significant. Rand Leather is a trans-owned business selling custom leather fetish wear to mainly queer folks. That's also pretty significant. So I worked on the redesign for their website. That was really fun, as well as really important to support trans folks, to support queer folks. These are the ways that I've decided to connect my values to my work. And as I continue to find ways to connect the two, I think it's really important to insert myself wherever I can. As an organizer, it isn't quite my job to take on design projects, but back in June, we had tons of momentum, thousands of people in the streets every day. I, along with about 100 other political organizers, coordinated a mass march in New York City to defund the NYPD. The march took place just a few days before the city council budget decision, and there were just huge crowds, thousands of people. I do wish that I had a photo of folks holding these posters because we had hundreds of them printed, and it was really cool to see them held throughout the crowd. Most recently, I've been working on some other ways, some other projects, just coordinating this virtual conference speaker series. For 3 weekends, we hold a series of panels designed to continue strategic conversations for leftist organizers. Last week, we discussed housing justice and Black Lives Matter. This week, we'll be discussing fighting the right and labor strategy. If you're curious about what this looks like, you're welcome to follow this bit.ly link to the registration page. It's free. And also you'll get a notification when the next panels are open for registration. I believe one of the topics will be electoral organizing, among some other things. So yeah, I mean, that's pretty much what I'm up to these days and how I got here. I'm always happy to have more internet friends, so feel free to connect on Instagram, pretty much the only social media platform I use, or you can email me. For now, I'm happy to take any questions. I'm kind of over the sound of my own voice, so I would love to hear from all of you. Thank you.
Adriana, that was incredible. Thank you. I'm clapping for you. I wonder, from the group, if you're feeling brave, you can just go ahead and unmute and ask a question if you have one for Adriana.
Well, thank you for sharing your experiences. There's definitely a lot of parallels that I find in my own design practice as a woman of color and like trying to navigate institutionalized spaces with design. So one of my questions is, I guess, just how are you looking at it now? Are you kind of fully engaged in the political intersection of your art, or you're kind of just taking it by ear in the sense of it doesn't really matter which direction, just as long as it feels good to you?
It's a little bit of both. I am hoping that my next like job 9 to 5 is more connected to my politics. It would be really exciting to work with or for other socialists, but at the same time recognizing that the job market is what it is, and I do have to kind of be realistic about some things. And so if it means that I have to shift my focus, whereas like, you know, now working at this agency where, you know, like we're not very political, we're not very lefty, but finding ways to like really push that in all of our projects and on the day-to-day. Even things as simple as like having open conversations about diversity and stuff like that on a daily basis with different team members. Yeah, it's just, it's a little bit of a mix, and I feel like I haven't really figured it out. So I feel like I would also be asking this question to someone else. But for now, it's kind of just like, I've been kind of making it up as I go along.
I'll jump in with a question. It's actually refreshing to hear someone say, you know, you're presenting to a group and you're still saying, hey, I'm still figuring it out. But I had a question about taking on freelance projects. And do you find that since you're working with mostly mission-driven organizations and nonprofits, if like budgetary constraints ever prevents you from taking on a project, even if you may be passionate about it, just kind of trying to prevent burnout, especially just like valuing your time? And if you could talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, I mean, I try my best to prioritize the projects that I'm super excited about. I have worked for free. I have like given some folks like really intense discounts, just because for me, it's been important to like connect to those folks in my community in that way and be an asset to them if I can. So I've yet to come across a situation where I've had to say no to a project. It's more just been me being really strict about how I navigate my 9 to 5. So there are times where I do work overtime because there are all these projects that we need done. And even now, you know, like in the height of this kind of like uprising, as some would call it, I've had the freedom to state some very clear boundaries with my employer. And that gives me extra time to take on projects that don't necessarily pay the bills, but do kind of like feed my soul and are more aligned with my values.
That makes sense. Thanks.
I'll jump in with a question. What is a piece of advice that you would have given yourself like 3 or 5 years ago?
Oh boy. Hmm. I mean, I think that, I don't know, it sounds very corny, but I do think, you know, like I mean, I deal with a lot of anxiety and depression and stuff. And I think that tends to lead to a lot of self-doubt. And it would have been really helpful if I had just learned to trust myself and trust my instinct earlier on. I think nowadays I definitely feel more confident. I feel more settled in who I am and what kind of designer I am and what kind of person I am. And that has, you know, like 3 or 5 years ago, I never would have asked my boss to stop asking me to work overtime, you know, so that I can take on more like passion projects on the side. But now it's kind of just been like, this is who I am. This is what's really important to me. If you have a problem with it, then you can find somebody else to do this job. Lord knows I'm always looking for another job, but you know, it's, I think I don't even know if it would be advice, but just it would have been nice to like assure myself that like you will get to a point where you feel very comfortable and very settled in who you are, and you shouldn't like second guess yourself too much, which is still something I struggle with, but certainly less so.
Thank you. We have a question in the chat that I'll read out. This is from Maria. You've mentioned that it required more time for research in college. Can you talk about influence to design regarding left revolution, etc., as you define yourself?
Oh wait, can you repeat that?
You've mentioned that it required more time for research in college. Can you talk about influence to design regarding left revolution, etc., as you define yourself?
Sure. Okay. So in terms of the extra time I took, you know, like putting in hours to like really figure out who I could look to for guidance, other designers and artists. You know, like we never really covered Glenn Ligon or Emory Douglas or any of those sort of like more revolutionary artists. When I was in school, it was very sort of like your standard cookie cutter, like art history, design history courses. And as I was coming into my identity, just really trying to find ways to like dig into that. And I'm still doing quite a bit of learning on that. For me, it was more just like, I never slept. It was kind of like, you know, I went to a very small school. Everyone knew that I was always kind of like wired at 2 a.m. And I was spending a lot of that time figuring out like how to identify as an artist and who to look to, and you know, lots of extra hours on the internet and in the library, and just like listening to talks on YouTube and stuff like that. You know, I don't know, it was very messy. I just feel like I was a little bit of a mess back then. You know, the project that I showed earlier, the Nigger project, that was something I put together in like a night and a half, just after feeling like so desperate for an introduction into some conversations about race at school, and feeling like, you know, if I asked a question, I was getting kind of like the runaround from my professors or my peers, and then just kind of being like, okay, well, if you are going to make a decision to avoid this, then I'm going to make a decision to like make it unavoidable. That kind of stuff. I don't know, it just kind of led to a lot of like impulsive and kind of like frantic behavior, because I was just so desperate for like reference and conversation and education that felt relevant to me. I'm not really sure if that answers the question. I feel like I was rambling a little bit, but Yeah.
I have one last question.
Okay.
So setting those boundaries are key, and speaking the honest truth can be seen as radical to some people, making them feel uncomfortable, which I think we should all feel somewhat uncomfortable to learn. But in that process, knowing as designers and artists, we have to pay the bills. Like, what has worked for you in putting your authentic self out there, social views and all, and still getting work that pays a livable income and finding people on that wavelength, etc.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I feel like that's still a big issue for me. Like working at a for-profit now, it's just, like at the time when I took the job, I was really, really interested in trying out project management. And this job allowed me to try that while also staying in my current role. And I knew that I would be compromising my integrity in some way. And so in my head, I kind of had this maybe like 6 month, 1 year plan where I was like, I can't stick around for too long. Sometimes it's like a little bit of compartmentalization. Sometimes it's just a little bit of making sure that you have good friends or good coworkers that you can kind of like debrief with and vent with afterwards. It is incredibly difficult for me to work from 9 to 5 every weekday. Like, to be perfectly honest, I don't enjoy my job. I do feel really conflicted at a capitalist agency, and I'm still trying to figure out like how to find a balance between my work and my values. And for right now, it's kind of been, the stuff that I do during the day feels a little soul sucking, but the stuff that I do after hours is what really like energizes me and feels important to me. And so that's where like the stuff with the DSA comes in, and working with the Afro Socialist Caucus. Everything that I do outside of work gives me the energy to then go back to work the next day.
Thank you so much.
Any other questions? Your bio begs it, so I'll ask. What is the secret to your egg poaching technique?
Okay, so every online tutorial tells you that you want to simmer the water. I actually think you need to bring it to a rolling boil. First of all, your egg will be done faster. And also, that's, I don't know, it's just the easiest way to do it. If you like simmer your water and then you make the whirlpool and then you drop the egg in, eventually the whirlpool is going to calm down, and then it's just going to be a weird shaped egg. But the rolling boil helps maintain the momentum of the whirlpool that you create in the beginning, and then you can plop the egg in the middle. And also you have to add vinegar to the water. Sometimes you don't, and it's okay. But the vinegar helps keep the shape with the yolk, and the rolling boil helps cook everything faster and in a much prettier shape.
Thank you for humoring me. We have another question in the chat. I'm struggling with the same type of capitalist job, wanting to do socialist work. Do you think that the type of 9-to-5 job you'd want to do that really aligns with your values exists?
Yes, I do think it exists. I've certainly thrown my hat in the ring for a couple opportunities that have come up within the past few weeks. And so that's been really exciting for me, because for the longest while, I really thought that I was just like making things up in my head, that there was no job for leftist designers who wanted to practice their politics in their work. I mean, it's a pretty, I feel like it's just that the pool is so limited. The amount of jobs that feel like adequately fulfilling are so limited. And so it kind of like forces you to try and force those dynamics in other places, you know? I mean, I don't mean to, you know, like badmouth any of my past employers or whatever, but, you know, like even as nonprofits, even as, you know, folks that view themselves on the left, like I've never had a job that felt really aligned with my politics or my values in a way that didn't feel like fake. Even with AIGA having a diversity and inclusion initiative, even with the ICA in Boston having a series of exhibits of Black artists, like all of that felt so superficial. And I spent a lot of time sort of like projecting my politics onto these places to try and make myself feel better about having to work there. But long story short, yes, I do believe that that kind of job does exist. I've seen it. I have friends who have been lucky enough to snag one or two, but it's just such a small number. Yeah.
Any other questions? Well, then I guess we can wrap up.